German-made rifle with the sniper scope sights that was found on the German-built Mauser with the sniper scope that was used to kill President Kennedy.
7.65 Mauser, German rifle, familiar to those who served in World War II.
Place. It's a 7.65 Mauser, German-made Army rifle, telescopic sight, and one shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells have been found nearby, and apparently they're hooking this as the murder weapon.
Sniper scope, high-powered Mauser
The Dallas
rifle.
Sheriff's Department said the rifle had been found in a staircase on the 5th floor of a building near the scene of the assassination. It was a 7.65 Mauser.
A German Mauser, I believe.
There is another word that a Mauser has been found.
Mauser.
Oswald worked in the building where the murder weapon, a German-made Mauser rifle, was
still found in the Mauser with which the assassin was apparently armed.
From Dallas, we have heard that the definite identification has been made of the type of rifle used in the assassination of President Kennedy. It was not a Mauser, as has been reported through most of yesterday and today, but an Italian Manlicher Carcanto, manufactured in the Italian town of Carcanto.
Yeah, Gary, of course, the Mauser was the first weapon that was found. I think the problem they had, although, is that they didn't have a paper trail to link the Mauser to Lee Oswald, and they belatedly realized that that was a problem, so that they had to effect a substitution, whereas in fact the Mauser is a high-quality weapon. It would have been appropriate for a shooting of this kind. The Mannlicher Carcano is a really ridiculous weapon, including especially the one that they claimed Oswald had used. It had a very difficult bolt action. It had a rusty fire pin. The weapon had a coy habit of blowing the firing pin out into the face of the shooter. The scope was misaligned. They would have been better off if they kept the Mauser in play, but the problem they had was connecting it with their alleged shooter, which proved to be the problem.
Yes, how embarrassing to report for a solid day, and every reporter of the time, Mauser, 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 and then how embarrassing for Walter Cronkite to have to get up there and lie to the country.
And I've always had a memory, matter of fact, I've had nightmares about it, of the sunlight on Kennedy and the explosion, the car almost coming to a stop, almost to a dead stop. And then
what I couldn't really believe, as someone else mentioned, was the car had, after that first shot, had come practically to a stop. And later on, in looking back, when I said I could not believe how well-trained Secret Service people reacted so slowly. I would have expected that from ordinary human beings, but I expected that they would have reacted much quicker.
Those in the cars behind saw that the presidential car stopped.
There was just an instantaneous, sort of an instant's pause, and in the motorcade it momentarily halted.
The car that the president was traveling, this was an open limousine that had been sent out from the White House fleet in Washington. This car came to an immediate stop.
Mrs. Kennedy screamed out, "Oh no!" The car stopped momentarily.
As we turned the corner to go by a small park right on the edge of town, we heard 3 shots. We heard the explosions. We didn't know what they were. And suddenly the motorcade slowed a little.
There was a brief pause. Then the cars rushed the wounded men to the Parkdale Hospital.
It is believed that a gap in the motorcade perhaps saved Vice President Johnson from being a target of the assassin today. The gap had opened up in the motorcade just before the assassin's bullets rang out.
Had the rain in Dallas lasted just a few moments more, perhaps as much as an hour more, the presidential car would have had its heavy plastic top on it. Plastic top certainly heavy enough to deflect a bullet of an assassin, probably to steer it entirely away from the body of the president and the governor of Texas.
Do we know why, in view of the turmoil which has been attributed to Dallas, to the warning which came from Ambassador Stevenson after his visit there, why the plastic bubble top was not on anyway?
I don't think anyone has made an official statement on that, Paul, but I would venture to hazard a guess immediately. It is The reason why is the personality of the late President of the United States, John Kennedy, who never, ever heeded the warnings of his Secret Service men against going into crowds, never, ever obeyed their wishes in staying behind ropes and behind railings where any large crowd was gathered.
Well, Gary, it's great to hear these witnesses reporting on the scene about the limousine stop. We actually have more than 60 witnesses. You can find their testimony collated together in John Costello's important resource, What Happened on Elm Street, The Eyewitnesses Speak, which is archived at assassinationresearch.com. But what is most important for us to observe is that when you have those who proclaim themselves to be experts on the assassination, but who deny the empirical evidence about the limo stop, for example, it impeaches their own credibility, even if a gullible group of sheep in the JFK community follow their lead in denying the obvious, which has been reinforced by the recent discovery of the Fred Newcomb interviews with the escort officers, which I have now published on Veterans Today under the title, The JFK Escort Officers Speak, the Fred Newcomb Interviews, where we learn not only that the officers confirmed the limo stop, but they had Officer Bobby Hargis, who had been riding to the left rear, who'd been hit with that debris so hard of Jack's brains and skull blowing out to the left rear. He initially thought he himself had been shot, actually walked between the limousines to get to the other side of Elm Street, which is further confirmation of my estimate that this limo stop was of longer duration than has heretofore been supposed, where I'm offering the suggestion that it had to be in the vicinity of 14 seconds. I mean, during the stop, after all, JFK is hit in the back of the head. He slumps forward. Jackie eases him back up. She's looking him right in the face. He's hit in the right temple. The bullet blows his brains to the left rear. He slumps to the left into the seat. Jackie climbs out the back of the trunk. Clint Hill comes up to the back, pushes her down, lies across. If that limo had already been accelerating, then Jackie would have been left on the street, as would Clint Hill. So, you know, the people who are either incredibly ignorant of elementary physics or are deliberately concealing the truth, because, of course, the limo stop, having been massively confirmed, impeaches the integrity of the Zapruder film, which they're desperate to conceal. Gordon Duff, the editor-in-chief of Veterans Today, once responded to my observation that I thought 50% of those in the JFK community were actually working for the other side, and he corrected me and said, no, Jim, 90%. I think we're finding litmus tests here, Gary, that reveal who they are.
Yeah, that's not to mention the overwhelming eyewitness testimony that's being ignored.
This is Ed Herbert at Hotel Texas, where 2,000 guests are awaiting the arrival of the President. Just about 30 seconds ago, the President finished a 10-minute appearance at the parking lot across the street from the hotel, and he is on his way up. We expect him to walk through this door at any moment. We've had several false starts, so to speak, that the President is coming. When he does, of course, there will be a large round of applause, and the Eastern Hills High School Band, 79 members, will break out with Hail to the Chief, so you'll have no doubt when he does arrive. When the President appeared out in the parking lot, he broke one of the cardinal rules of security. In fact, he broke it 2 or 3 times. He went out into the crowd, and of course Secret Service men find this the most nervous time of any presidential appearance. As long as the Secret Service men can keep the crowd away from the President, they have a good chance of protecting him. But once he moves into a crowd, the Secret Service men are nearly immobilized in protecting him. Another rule is that anyone who approaches the President should have both hands visible and empty. And as you can tell in a crowd, there's no way to determine that. So whenever the President does move out into a crowd for handshaking and backslapping and exchanging pleasantries, he is always at the mercy of the crowd, and the Secret Service is at its least effective position. on September 6, 1901, those two rules were broken, and it ended in tragedy. That was the day that President William McKinley was appearing at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, and at a public reception, the crowd moved in around him, and the 3 Secret Service men who were guarding him had no chance to screen the people approaching him. Because it was a hot day, the Secret Service also allowed persons to have handkerchiefs in their hands to wipe their perspiring brows. It just so happened that one of the thousands of handkerchiefs in that large hall covered a revolver in the hand of 28-year-old Leon Czolgosz. He was an unemployed mill worker. He said he was an anarchist. He was also was a man with a long history of mental illness. And as in many important occasions of the world, no one seemed to sense that anything different was going to happen. When McKinley reached out to shake Czolgosz's hand, it looked like a familiar scene. The scene of the President of the United States shaking hands with Fred Nobody. The assassin shattered that picture quickly. He slapped McKinley's hand away and fired 2 shots point blank. In an instant, McKinley's attacker was driven to the floor. As the President was being helped to a chair, McKinley murmured, "Don't let them hurt him." 7 days later, McKinley was dead. Oddly enough, the assassination attempt was staged in the Temple of Music, quite an ironical note, and there was a quiet Bach sonata being played in the background when the 2 fatal shots rang out. Now here comes Vice President Johnson, Governor Conley, Senator Ralph Yarborough, Congressman Jim Wright, State Senator Don Kennard. Here comes the President.
Well, Gary, there's several interesting aspects to this. One is Vince Palomara, who's the leading expert on the Secret Service, whose own agents say, "Vince, you know more about the Secret Service than we do." JFK always complied with the Secret Service requirements and directives. He did not circumvent them. And while, yes, he did like to have direct contact with the crowd, it cannot be the case that he was doing so. You know, they may have suggested he not do it, but they didn't insist that he not do it because he was compliant. And not only that, but the fact of the matter is he wasn't shot going into a crowd and violating those 2 conditions. And the introduction of the assassination of McKinley is clearly a psyop to implant seeds, even down to the name Leon of the assassin. Remarkable coincidence, since, you know, Lee Oswald would actually even be introduced as Leon in at least one of the stories that has been reported to us about him. But the fact of the matter is this is, I think, very obviously setting things up, preparing the mind of the public for JFK taking risks and violating protocol and putting himself in danger. The report, instead of talking about McKinley, should have been just raving about how the crowd was just wildly, you know, circling him, wouldn't wait to get their hands on him, cheering, cheering, cheering. That's what a reporter ought to have been doing, but this one clearly is operating on behalf of the agency to set things up psychologically for the American public for what is to come.
Were you on duty?
Well, no, I was on duty, but a couple hours before Kennedy was to arrive, sheriff called us in, what I call the street people, the plainclothesmen, the detectives, and he instructed us that we were to stand out in front and in no way take part in the security of that motorcade, that we were merely spectators and nothing more.
Did that seem unusual to you?
It did to me at the time because there were so many people around and so few Dallas police officers. This is one of the first things I noticed was the lack of Dallas police officers. Try to keep the people back.
Well, it's of course fascinating that Roger Craig is reporting that Sheriff Bill Decker had instructed them they were to not participate in any way in the protection of the motorcade. I mean, here you have the President of the United States, presumably the one individual in the world most deserving of protection. Officially, the role of the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department in relation to the motorcade ended at the intersection of Houston and Elm. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? It's obvious that Bill Decker was deeply involved in planning for the assassination, as were local FBI and Secret Service agents. Roger Craig is a good man, and of course he would eventually pay his life for it.
The President came by, and they made the right turn onto Houston Street. And, I'll say, a few seconds later, give them time to get to Elm Street and make the left. I heard what was what I call a report, a gunshot. And I said, oh my God. And I turned and started toward Houston Street, running just as hard as I could. And I was probably 15 steps from Houston Street. And before I reached those 15 steps, I heard 2 more reports.
Then you arrived at Elm Street.
Right.
The second shot, the third shot total, hit President Kennedy, and there was no doubt there. His head went forward with considerable violence.
The thing about this is Roger Craig clearly wasn't in the position to observe the limousine stop, but, everyone in the motorcade was aware of it. Fury Campbell, the wife of the mayor, was quite emphatic about the motorcycle stop, about the motorcade having stopped. She said everyone was aware of it. I mean, there's just no question about it. As far as hearing, the 3 shots, since all of the weapons were unsilenced, the only weapon that was unsilenced was from being fired from the Dow Tex to create that acoustical impression of 3 shots fired from the book depository. Craig wasn't thinking about the use of unsilenced weapons, but of course we know JFK alone was hit 4 different times. There were 3 shots that missed, and then Conley was hit anywhere from 1 to 3 times, so we have a total of 8, 9, or 10 shots. As far as the, rushing up onto the grassy knoll, including by a motorcycle officer, of course, all that is very well documented and correct, and of course is indicative of the belief of the spectators in the plaza at the time that some of the shots had come from that direction, which of course the Warren Commission completely obfuscated, did not address at all, and therefore, sought to smooth out by ignoring any evidence contrary to its predetermined conclusion that there had been one and only one shooter in the book depository building.
I worked in that area for, probably 7, 8 minutes, maybe, something like that, until I ran on to Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Rowland. Now, Mr. Rowland told me that 15 minutes before the motorcade arrived, he saw 2 men on the 6th floor of the school book depository. Now, one was a white male in the east corner of the 6th floor with a rifle. The other one was a colored male at the west end of the 6th floor, pacing back and forth.
Well, I saw this man in the window, and he had a gun in his hands pointed downward. The man evidently was in a kneeling position because his forearms were resting on the window sill. There was another man standing beside him, but I only saw a portion of his body because he was standing partly against, behind the window, only halfway in the window. And the window was dirty and I couldn't see his face up above. Also, the window was pushed up. And it startled me, and then I thought, well, they probably have guards, possibly in all the buildings. So I didn't say anything. And I heard one shot, and I thought at the time that the first shot was a firecracker. And 2 more shots. And then a few seconds later and more, it wasn't as loud as the others. And then I thought, oh, it's gunshot. And a woman looked at me and pointed at this building.
Well, Gary, what Ms. Rowland has to say is extremely important, and of course, once again, it's the kind of evidence that the Warren Commission went out of its way to suppress because it raises too many questions that they're unable to answer, given that they're out to frame the patsy. When you talked about, the first shot is the sound of the firecracker, actually the first hit on JFK was fired from the top of the county records building with a silenced weapon, hit him in the back 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column. The second shot was fired from the south end of the triple underpass and passed through the windshield, which is what created that sound of a firecracker en route to hitting JFK in the throat. And of course other shots were fired, but the only unsilenced ones were 3 from the Dow Tech. One of which missed and hit a curb and injured the distant bystander James Haig, another of which missed and hit the chrome strip over the windshield, but the third of which, after the limo stop, hit JFK in the back of the head, causing him to slump forward. So her observations seem to be very, very significant, but where the figures in the window weren't actually shooters, but mock shooters. I mean, it was someone to create the impression, so you'd have people like Mrs. Rowland who could testify about it. We all know that if there had been a lone gunman in that location, that his best possible shots would have been as a limousine was approaching the book depository on Houston, where the body, the torso, the head are getting closer and closer and closer, and where even a mediocre marksman like Lee Oswald, had he had a decent weapon, might well have been able to hit the target. But of course, they were waiting for the limo to turn into the kill zone on Elm Street, and disciplined gunmen that they were, until the sequence that they'd been instructed to follow would take place.
I went to the south side of Elm Street to look for any signs of any bullets striking the curb or the street or anything. By this time, it had been established that the president hadn't been shot. And Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters joined me at that time. Everybody was coming to the scene of the shooting, which is normal. People are just that way. But as I was searching the south curb of Elm Street, I heard a shrill whistle. And I looked up. It just drew my attention. It was coming from across the street. And there was a light green Rambler station wagon driving real slow west on Elm Street. And the driver was leaning over to his right, looking up at a man running down the grass. So I immediately tried to cross the street to take these two people into custody for questioning. Just, everybody else was coming to the scene. These were the only two people leaving. I mean, this was suspicious in my mind, at the time. So I wanted to talk to them. But I couldn't get across the street because the city officer who was stationed at Houston and Elm had left his post, and the traffic, was so heavy I just couldn't get across the street to him. But I did get a good look at the man coming down the grassy knoll. And he got into the station wagon, and they drove west on Elm Street. It had been determined that the shots came from the southeast window. How, I don't know. The Dallas police were saying this, so we immediately went there. And Deputy Sheriff Luke Mooney was with me when we found the shells. We found 3 hogs beside the window on the 6th floor. And they were laying 3 in a row, not more than an inch.
This was brass, the 3 spent cartridges.
3 spent cartridges. They were lying 3 in a row, not more than an inch apart, all pointing in the same direction. Of course, I didn't touch them. They hadn't been photographed or fingerprinted or anything. I didn't touch those. And there was a lunch sack, very small, brown paper lunch sack up there. Had some chicken bones in it. And there was a soda bottle sitting on a box. And we began then to search for a weapon. And we started toward, everybody took a different direction, and Deputy Sheriff Boone and myself just happened to head for the northwest corner of the building. And Boone was ahead of me by about 8 feet. And there were a stack of boxes just at the head of the stairwell going downstairs. And Boone looked over into it and said, "Here it is. Here's the rifle." So I immediately went over beside him and looked over, and there was a rifle. But we didn't touch it until Captain Fritz and Lieutenant Day from the ID department of the Dallas Police Department got there. Now, Captain Fritz was Chief of Homicide, and Lieutenant Day was from the Identification Bureau. They got there and took some pictures of the rifle. And then I believe Dave pulled the rifle out and handed it to Captain Fritz, who held it up by the, had a strap on it. He held it up by the strap and asked if anyone knew what kind of rifle it was. Well, by this time, Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman had joined us. And Weitzman was a gun buff. He had a sporting goods store at one time. He was very good with weapons. And he said it looks like a Mauser. And he walked over to Fritz. And Captain Fritz was holding the rifle up in the air. And I was standing next to Weitzman, who was standing next to Fritz. And we weren't any more than 6 or 8 inches from the rifle. And stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser. And that's when Weitzman said it is a Mauser and pointed to the 7.65 Mauser stamp on the barrel.
There's an intonation to that statement that it should mean something.
Well, the shells we found came from a 6.5 Italian rifle.
You mean those 3 cartridges?
The two don't relate.
3 cartridges that were
found at the southeast corner.
In the southeast corner.
Came from a 6.5 Italian carbine.
Well, Gary, what's interesting about this is that Larry Rivera, who's an extremely good student of this case, has discovered reasons to doubt the official story that Lee Oswald left the building, caught a bus, got jammed in traffic, switched to a cab, and made his way back to his rooming house, which leaves open the possibility that may, in fact, have been Lee Oswald heading down to the Rambler, which Roger Craig doesn't confirm here, but would later assert had been Lee Oswald. And I must say, therefore, we have, of course, 2 completely discrepant accounts of how Lee may have left the building. In addition, in talking about the 3 1-inch space, neatly aligned shell casings that came from the Mannlicher Carcano, obviously any trained, experienced detective or sheriff is going to notice that they had to have been arranged. When this is a bolt-action rifle, it would flip the shells out when you work the bolt. They wouldn't neatly align. Not only that, of course, but the fact is that in the evidence photographs taken both by the FBI and by the Dallas Police Department, we find only 2 spent shell casings, 1 unspent, which is very, very interesting in relation to what Roger Craig is saying here, because if there actually were 3 spent shell casings, as he suggests, they ought to have been in the evidence photographs, showing 2 unspent and 2 spent and 1 unspent. So this is just one more indication of the way in which the evidence in this case was being manipulated and fudged.
Mr. Nix, where were you on November 22nd? 1963.
Standing on the corner of Main and Houston.
And did you take any pictures of the presidential limousine as it went through Dealey Plaza?
Yes, I've taken pictures before and after, before the assassination and during the assassination.
And you know, of course, that your pictures were eventually used by the government to determine where the limousine was when some of the shots were fired.
Yes.
Did you deliver a copy of your film to the federal government?
Yes, I delivered a copy of my film to the federal government about December the 1st.
About a little over a week after the assassination.
Yes, my film got lost in the processing plant.
Where is the original film?
The original film belonged to United Press International. The government has a duplicate copy.
And where is that duplicate copy?
In the archives.
And is that the duplicate copy which was used by the Warren Commission for the purpose of determining, along with other film, the Muchmore film and the Zapruder film, where the presidential limousine was when some of the shots were fired?
I would say so.
Well, you now have a copy of your film, which you were kind enough to show to us this afternoon. Is that copy the same as the original which you gave to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no. There is some films maybe missing, some frames. Some of the frames were ruined.
Does the film which you have at the present time have the same number of frames as the film which you delivered to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no, but it's because of losing maybe a frame here and there.
At the time the shots were fired, did you look at the book depository building?
No.
Did you think at that time that the shots came from the book depository building?
No, I thought it came from a fence between the book depository and the railroad track. Most everyone thought it came from the fence behind the book depository.
Dallas motorcycle officers who were ranging along beside the cavalcade took off across the field in the direction from which the murderer apparently had fired. One officer raced to the foot of a nearby railroad embankment and climbed to the tracks above, gun in hand.
You say, of course, that the motorcade speeded up immediately and rushed towards the hospital.
Disappeared under the underpass, and I had jumped out by that time and was running with the police. They thought the assailants had fled over some railroad tracks, and they'd been through what they thought was the assailants through several trains coming on the tracks, and I went with them, and therefore didn't see the president immediately as he went under the underpass.
Well, did they apprehend this person they were
No, they apprehended nobody at that time. They went back and started talking to witnesses on the scene.
I see.
I grabbed a couple of eyewitnesses to it and brought them back to the studio, and all of the policemen who were around where the building where we were shot were running back toward the railroad tracks, back behind, trying to find out who it was. Complete bedlam there at the site.
And stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser. And that's when Watchman said it is a Mauser and pointed to the 7.65 Mauser stamp on the barrel.
There's an intonation to that statement that it should mean something.
Well, the shells we found came from a 6.5 Italian rifle.
You mean those three
cartridges? The two don't relate.
Three cartridges that were
found at the southeast corner.
In the southeast corner.
Came from a 6.5 Italian carbine.
Mauser German-made rifle with the sniper scope sights that was found on the German-built Mauser with the sniper scope that was used to kill President Kennedy.
7.65 Mauser, German rifle, familiar to those who served in World War II.
Place. It's a 7.65 Mauser, German-made Army rifle, telescopic sight, and one shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells have been found nearby, and apparently they're hooking this as the murder weapon.
Sniper scope, high-powered Mauser
The Dallas
rifle.
Sheriff's Department said a rifle had been found in a staircase on the 5th floor of a building near the scene of the assassination. It was a 7.65 Mauser.
A German Mauser, I believe.
There is another word that a Mauser has been found.
Mauser.
Oswald worked in the building where the murder weapon, a German-made Mauser rifle, was
one still found in the Mauser with which the assassin was apparently armed.
From Dallas, we have heard that a definite identification has been made of the type of rifle used in the assassination of President Kennedy. It was not a Mauser, as has been reported through most of yesterday and today, but an Italian Manlichter Carcanto, manufactured in the Italian town of Carcanto.
And I've always had a memory, matter of fact, I've had nightmares about it, of the sunlight on Kennedy and the explosion, the car almost coming to a stop, almost to a dead stop. And
what I couldn't really believe that someone else mentioned was the car had, after that first shot, had come practically to a stop. And later on, in looking back, when I said I could not believe how well-trained Secret Service people reacted so slowly. I would have expected that from ordinary human beings, but I expected that they would have reacted much quicker.
Those in the cars behind saw that the presidential car stopped.
It was just an instantaneous, sort of an instant pause, and in the motorcade it momentarily halted.
The car that the president was traveling, this was a limousine that had been sent out from the White House fleet in Washington. This car came to an immediate stop.
Mrs. Kennedy screamed out, "Oh no!" The car stopped momentarily.
As we turned the corner to go by a small park right on the edge of town, we heard 3 shots. We heard the explosions. We didn't know what they were. And suddenly the motorcade slowed a little.
There was a brief pause. Then the cars rushed the wounded men to the Parkdale Hospital.
It is believed that a gap in the motorcade perhaps saved Vice President Johnson from being a target of the assassin today. The gap had opened up in the motorcade just before the assassin's bullets rang out.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, we're going to listen to some clips from a wonderful, wonderful video called Revision of Evidence that took old, obscure news clips and put them together where there was no narrator to let the clips do the talking. And here, what we're going to try to do is go through these times, and then what you're hearing is what the government is wanting you to hear. But what we'd like to know is, what do we know now, and who were these people? And so let's comment on what it really was that was going on when these things were being said. Here we go. First clip. Cronkite and propaganda about Lee and Cuba.
There has been an interesting development in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old former Marine, avowed Marxist and member of the Committee of Fair Play for Cuba, not the Free Cuba Committee as had been suggested here earlier, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the pro-Castro group. This interesting development, still highly speculative, but with all sorts of possibilities. His personnel records have been sent to Dallas and to Washington for examination, and they have disclosed a letter he wrote to then Secretary of Navy John Connally, who is now the governor of Texas and who was wounded yesterday in the shooting that killed President Kennedy.
Well, Gary, we have a case here where Walter Cronkite is officially correcting the statement of Henry Wade, the Dallas DA, that Lee had been with the Free Cuba Committee, where Jack Ruby had called out to correct him with Fair Play for Cuba instead, because, of course, these two organizations were diametrically opposed. The Free Cuba Committee wanted to free Cuba from communist domination and was opposed to Castro. The Fair Play for Cuba wanted Castro and Cuba to get a fair shake from the United States and was in sympathy with Fidel, so that clearly, given the effort to portray Lee as a pro-Castro communist sympathizer, that was indispensable to make that correction for the record, and Walter Cronkite was the conduit.
All right, here we go. Now, the next clip is Nixon is cast to the forefront of the presidential nomination.
Conversation here, frankly, unofficially, cannot help but speculate that these unfortunate events have suddenly projected Mr. Nixon once again and very firmly into the presidential picture.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, you've said it more than one time that there would be no chance of a succession of presidents without the death of JFK. Go ahead.
Well, the fact is, Lyndon, of course, would win an overwhelming election on his own right in the aftermath of the assassination. It had been indispensable to draw Nixon into the conspiracy where he was present at the home of Clint Murchison Sr. the night before, because having so narrowly lost to JFK, there was good reason to expect that he might well become president in the near future, and they were very concerned that no one should occupy that office who would have the least inclination to reopen the investigation of the death of JFK.
Absolutely. All right, now this isn't a kind of obscure clip where President Eisenhower has asked his comments on the death of the president.
Will the nation be all right in a few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right. Thank you.
All right, what's your comments on that, Dr.
Well, two comments really, Gary. On the one hand, Eisenhower, of course, had delegated to Nixon the task of organizing Operation 40, which became an assassination team, some of whose members appear to have been involved in not only JFK, but a number of other assassinations around the world. But where it looks to me as though it may well be that LBJ was concerned that talk about a conspiracy or Russian involvement should be suppressed, and that Eisenhower, Soviet involvement, that Eisenhower is playing a role there. I don't sense a great deal of conviction in his voice about what he's saying, but I think he was fulfilling a role.
Overly cautious. All right, you were just talking about Russia and nukes. Here we go.
The mechanics of the takeover are already in operation.
Now, Defense Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy are briefing him in such terms as mega deaths. White House and Pentagon shorthand for the millions of deaths which are now in the hands of President Lyndon Johnson in case there should be a thermonuclear exchange. The words death of Earth are being exchanged.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, it's all about the end of the world.
Well, here really it's just simply affirming that Lyndon Johnson is the new president. He's the guy who's got his finger on the nuclear button, and I don't think there's very much going on here, Gary, in all candor.
Wasn't it one of the main reasons that everyone was told to be quiet because of a possible nuclear thermal threat? And it seems like they're laying the groundwork.
Well, that's true, Gary, yes, because Lyndon would use the claim that they knew who was responsible and that it had been through Castro that the Soviets had brought about the assassination, and therefore to avoid the death of 30 million people that it had to be covered up, and that was an argument he used to persuade Earl Warren to assume the position, even though of the chairman of the commission, even though as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court he should never have been cast in that role. After all, if the commission had done its job, actually found culprits to prosecute, the case would have eventually made its way through the court and come before the Supreme Court, whose chief was already, contaminated and couldn't have participated in the court's deliberation by virtue of his previous involvement.
All right, yes. All right, so now we're going to Walter Cronkite, and he's talking about Soviet propaganda, and it appears to me that he's describing the truth, and they're saying, well, you can't believe this because it's Soviet propaganda.
Radio commentator Valentin Zorin, one of their respected, as far as the Soviet goes, mouthpieces of the Kremlin, is trying to counter charges on Moscow radio that President Kennedy was a victim of a leftist fanatic. He has said, those who know how the security of President Kennedy is organized know that it is not possible for a fanatic to commit such an assassination. A political crime, thoroughly prepared and planned, has taken place, Valentin Zorin says. And this terribly inflammatory statement by one of the kingpins of Soviet propaganda in Moscow. He went on to say, quote, "It is not accidental that it took place in the southern states, which are well known as a stronghold of racist and other fascist scum. It is precisely here that Goldwater," referring of course to Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who is one of the contenders for the presidency, gets his support. We repeat, in case anybody could mistake the import of these words, that this is Soviet propaganda broadcast by Moscow radio commentator Valentin Zorin. Zorin went on to charge that the president's slaying was inspired by forces opposed to President Kennedy's policy of improving relations with the Soviet Union.
Wow, it seems like he was calling it out right there, Dr. Fetzer. What do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right. They had to suppress it immediately and give it a spin so it's all propaganda. He's an expert on propaganda, clearly trying to mislead the public. But the fact is, what he said was exactly right. If it had not been for the stand down by the Secret Service, where we have more than 15 indications of their complicity in setting him up for the hit, including leaving 2 agents who would have run beside or ridden on the back of the presidential limousine behind at Love Field, putting the vehicles in the wrong order, where instead of the presidential limousine being more or less in the middle of the motorcade, preceded by flatbed trucks with reporters and film cameras, it was put out front, which is, of course, an outrageous insult. Anyone familiar with intelligence would recognize that that was a grotesque abuse.
Doctor, is there a name for or a type of fallacy when you give the truth out but blame it on your adversaries?
Well, it's a form of spinning, of course. I mean, this is propagandistic, just really deliberately misinforming the public. They're attacking the source, so it's a kind of a sophisticated form of an ad hominem by implying that he is a propagandist. So essentially, it's a political form of an ad hominem attack.
They must know what they're doing, because it would seem dangerous to me to go ahead and give the truth out and just say it was someone else that said it. All right, here we go. On to the next clip, Cronkite and the Dallas Luncheon.
That was a report from Eddie Barker at our affiliate KRLD in Dallas, Texas. The scene you saw was the luncheon to which President Kennedy was en route. He was planning to address that luncheon in one of his strongest statements yet against those who, as he said, would turn the clock back, but he did not get an opportunity to make that speech.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, it appears that they're really pushing the Russian threat here, and that's what Walter Cronkite was talking about. So any comments on that?
Well, just beneath the surface, I mean, the trademark was a change in where JFK was to speak. It was supposed to have been the Women's Forum, which the Secret Service had cleared. The Women's Forum was very secure. The trademark was not. It had lots of balconies, entrances, and exits that would have been easy for assassins to enter and escape. And this, of course, was used as a pseudo-justification for making the change to the motorcade route instead of going forward onto Main Street, which could have got him to his destination. Actually, either way, it was used to turn from Maine onto Houston and back onto Elm to get onto the Stemmons Freeway. So the fact he's talking about the trademark actually is significant in the way in which the assassination was set up.
I see. All right, now we're going to have a clip from former Eisenhower press secretary Jim Haggerty saying it has to be a setup.
With me in the studio here is a man who spent 8 years as press secretary for President Eisenhower and is used to the precautions taken for the president's safety. And he is Jim Haggerty, now vice president of ABC Paramount Pictures.
Don, as I said a little earlier, I think this, like the Puerto Rican attempt in front of Blair House in 1950, has to be a planned conspiracy.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, what do you say about Jim Haggerty?
Well, they had to get him off the air fast. I'm sure they did, Gary, because, I mean, he's an old, experienced, smart guy, and he was speaking the truth, which has become a rare commodity. You couldn't find a politician today who would admit, for example, that the incursion of Israel into Gaza was grossly unjustified and a horrendous slaughter, which is one of the most horrific acts of recent history. It's taking place, and the United States, to my consternation, remains mute and silent, just as we are remaining mute and silent as the Ukraine attempts to slaughter the pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine. The United States has completely forfeited its moral authority. I wish we only had more like Jim Haggerty, whom I remember from my youth. He was a good man, and it's a shame we don't have more like him.
All right, we're going to go into the clips. So talking about General Walker. There's three quick ones. I guess I'll stop on each one here. All right, General Walker.
This Monday, November 18th, a warmer welcome greets Alabama's Governor George Wallace, bitter foe of school integration. Among his approving listeners is former General Edwin Walker, himself a spokesman for those who are darkly certain that the American dream is being betrayed, even by some elected leader.
It seems that they're trying to paint him as a Southern racist along with George Wallace.
Well, Gary, I'd look at it the other way around. They're using his authority as a general to convey the impression that some elected leaders are betraying the principles of America. And, of course, they're targeting JFK, no doubt. So I think that was really a subtle way of expressing that there was resentment in the South and among, the military to JFK's leadership. That would be my take.
I guess that's why you got the PhD behind your name. All right, Dr. Fetzer, let's go on to Chief Curry. And he's talking about General Walker as well.
This is a rifle that killed the president.
How many shots had been fired from the rifle?
3.
Have you been able to trace the rifle? Do you know where it was
we're
purchased?
attempting to do that at this time.
Is there any connection yet between this and the firing of Major General Walker?
I do not know.
All right, so he was asked if the rifle had bent traced to General Walker as the presidential rifle that killed JFK.
Of course, as it would turn out, the Walker weapon appears to have been a 30-06, firing at a stationary target from a short distance, and he missed. So the idea that the same marksman would have been involved there and then use the Mannlicher Carcano to fire at a much, much more difficult moving target and succeed is extremely implausible. Whether Lee had anything to do with Walker, in my opinion, is not completely certain. But they wanted to use that to attempt to frame him for a previous act of violence in spite of the gross discrepancies, the differences between the two cases I have just described.
I've heard the argument brought up that General Walker was basically reading a paper right by the window, which would have been impossible to miss, and then we have Oswald missing the car completely. So what do you think about that as a fair comparison?
I agree. It's ridiculous to suggest this was the same person. And if he had a 30-06 available for Walker, he surely ought to have used it in relation to JFK, which is just one more sign that this was a fabricated event. I mean, they had a paper trail, which was itself fabricated. For the Mannlicher Carcano, which is a very odd caliber, a 30-06 could be bought on any corner store in Dallas without even showing any IDs, which is why they had to, frame him using an obscure World War II weapon.
All right, here's Walter Cronkite.
From Dallas, Texas, the first comment from former Major General Edwin Walker, who is one of the more vocal right-wing leaders in the United States. He said that the death of Mr. Kennedy is not as surprising as it is tragic. This prepared statement he handed to newsmen from his Dallas home said this: "The tragic events of yesterday demonstrate the internal threat that can never be underestimated."
All right, Dr. Fetzer, more on General Walker.
Well, talking about the internal threat, Lee Oswald actually wasn't a threat. He was an informant for the FBI at this stage in his career. He'd been recruited by the Office of Naval Intelligence to recruit people in San Diego. He'd been stationed at Atsugi, our most secure base. He'd made a pseudo-defection to the Soviet Union at the behest of the CIA. And when he returned, he was not treated as a traitor, but given money by the CIA front organization to relocate. He wound up in New Orleans, where he was sheep-dipped by being given this new persona as a pro-Castro communist sympathizer. So, this is just a statement by Walker that's supposed to be showing that he's a good American and he's concerned about these issues and he's being, as it were, in Fox News terminology, fair and balanced.
All right, let's move on to Henry Wade. No confession, but we have sufficient evidence. This was before he had the case just pretty much sewed up. Here we go, Henry Wade.
Do you expect a confession from this man?
No.
You do not.
It's a strong case. I think it's sufficient.
What is the evidence that links him to the gun?
I don't care to go into the evidence.
All right, Henry Wade doesn't care to go into the evidence. What do you think, Dr. Fetzer?
Well, of course he doesn't, because, Lee said that was his face based on someone else's body related to the backyard photographs, and we have proven that to be true. He told Will Fritz that he was out with Bill Shelley in front. We have proven that to be true. He passed his nitrate test, which indicated that he hadn't fired a rifle or a carbine. He still had nitrates on his hands, but that was innocuous because he worked in a book depository, moving boxes of books which are printed in ink which contains nitrates. They had a palm print that had been planted on the weapon while the body was in the funeral home. I mean, any reasonably competent defense attorney could have dismantled any case the government attempted to make against Lee Oswald for the assassination of JFK.
All right, you're listening to The Real Deal with Dr. James Fetzer as we go through the obscure news clips that have been uncovered by these fantastic researchers and it's a great video. It's called Revision of Evidence, and they're just a montage of montages, the mother of all montages. We'll be right back after some cool Beatles music and a couple of ads.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where today we have a special 2-hour JFK show with Gary King and Larry Rivera. During the first hour, I'm going to be commenting on a number of audio tapes from the day of the assassination of JFK. During the second hour, Larry Rivera is going to give us a review of a new book by Gail Nix, and I think you're going to find it quite fascinating.
We're going to be plowing through the montage of clips on the day of the Kennedy assassination. We've got Dr. James Fetzer, the man, really breaking it down about what's really going on, because what we're hearing, we really didn't know what was really going on at the time. So we're going to start off with no more questions for Oswald.
Do you mind if we shout a question at him without stopping him?
No questions at him, no way. No questions at all. The more you upset him, the more difficult it is for us to talk to him.
We want to do whatever you want us to do. So if you say no questions.
If you go beyond the door. Back up as far as you can against that wall. I want you to say this.
Can we call that the second part of the interrogation?
No. Don't want you calling out nothing.
Let's make it clear we have all agreed with the chief that we will not ask Oswald any questions.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, no more questions for Oswald.
Well, I think it's obvious, Gary, that they felt that even his previous remarks, including that he was just a patsy, that a policeman had hit him, that he'd requested legal counsel and so forth, were too sincere and, as it were, obviously true, that they didn't want him making any more revelations that could complicate the case of framing him for a crime he did not commit, or two, since, of course, they also charged him with the death of Officer J.D. Tippett, which he equally did not commit. So I think that's just the basic here. They're trying to put a lid on Oswald's opportunity to communicate with the press, lest something untoward emerge.
All right, now a pretty obscure clip from Senator Yarborough talking about what Miss Kennedy said and what he heard in Dealey Plaza.
And I walked up to the car where Mrs. Kennedy was still there on the back seat, lying there with her head bowed over, covering her husband's head, his blood running down her leg and on her clothes, and twice saying, "They've murdered my husband. They've murdered my husband."
All right, Dr. Fetzer, Yarborough.
Well, this is, of course, very touching, and, of course, Yarborough was unaware that he was LBJ's choice to be riding in the limousine with JFK, where he was the intended target of the shooter from the Dow Tex, who I believe to have been Malcolm Mack Wallace, Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, who murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters. But where LBJ and JFK had a huge argument that morning, where Lyndon wanted to get Connally out and Yarborough in, and JFK overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. and there wasn't enough time to get the word to the shooters that it was going to be Connolly instead of Yarborough. Jackie, it's clear to me, was profoundly affected by the death of JFK. She truly loved the man. Most important, even more important than what Yarborough is reporting here, is that in her testimony to the commission, which it did not publish on the grounds of privacy, but which it really had to keep under wraps because it blew apart the case they were seeking to make against Oswald, said that from the front he looked just fine, but that she had had a terrible time holding his skull and brains together at the back, which of course was evidence that he had a blowout at the back of his head caused by a shot from the front, actually, which had entered the right temple, and not that he had suffered a high-velocity wound from behind, which almost certainly would have blown out, the front of his head at some location. So that what she said really was a form of refutation that there had been only one gunman, and therefore they couldn't allow it out, and to have a plausible reason, they maintained it was on the basis of privacy.
All right, you were just talking about Connolly.
I said, my God, they're going to kill us all. My God, they're going to kill us all.
And I said, my God, they're going to kill us all. And I said, oh my God, they're going to kill us all.
And then I said, my God, they're going to kill us all.
Jacqueline Kennedy stayed close to her husband's casket during the 2-hour and 20-minute flight back to Washington.
All right, let's talk about Connolly before we go on to Jackie's being really close to the casket the entire time.
Well, the remarks by Connolly reflect that, when he discovered he himself had been shot, I think he was genuinely concerned that he was going to be killed. I have no doubt at all, was very much aware of the plan to assassinate JFK. And you can see as a rather grim expression on his countenance that morning, especially after Lyndon had been unsuccessful in getting him out. And I think this was just a spontaneous statement from him when he was shot, and he may have entertained some fears that in fact he was going to die along with JFK. As far as Jackie staying with a casket, the body appears to have been removed from the bronze ceremonial casket aboard Air Force One and placed into a body bag, which was then put into a compartment at the back of the plane and offloaded onto a helicopter when they were bringing out the bronze ceremonial casket with Jackie, which no longer had the body inside, which was, of course, loaded into the gray Navy ambulance. Jackie got in and rode with it all the way to Bethesda, where JFK's body had been separately transported to Walter Reed, where the best forensic pathologists in the military had removed bullet fragments. They couldn't have rounds of different calibers or makes emerging from all of this. And then they put him into back into that body bag and into a pinkish gray shipping casket of the kind in which bodies were being sent back from Vietnam in the back of a black hearse and driven to the back of the Bethesda hospital, where it was offloaded. Part of what turned out to be a rather elaborate scheme of multiple ambulances, where Doug Horton has the most detailed and specific reconstruction. But where Gerald Custer, whom I got to know, the radiologist who took the x-rays, was heading upstairs in the company of two Secret Service agents to have x-rays he'd taken developed. When he looked out the window and saw the huge entourage in the Navy ambulance and Jackie coming into the building, and said to himself, what's going on here? Because, of course, he knew the body was already in the morgue undergoing autopsy. So this is all very, very much a part of the sleight of hand that was used to deceive the public about the whereabouts of the body during this crucial interval of time.
Well, wait, hold on, Doctor. Jane Parley says that Miss Kennedy was by the casket the whole time.
Jacqueline Kennedy stayed close to her husband's casket during the 2-hour and 20-minute flight back to Washington. And she stayed close once Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base, still wearing her blood-stained clothes. Let them see what they've done, she said.
All right, go ahead, Doctor.
Well, except that, of course, we have a famous photograph of her staying by Lyndon Johnson while he was being sworn in, so Jane Pauley doesn't have it quite right, does she? And that's one of two occasions during which the body might have been moved during the swearing-in, which has heretofore been my supposition. But another story has emerged relatively recently that the body may have been moved immediately upon getting the casket into the plane, or at least as soon as they made room for it in the back, because they had to remove some chairs from the aircraft in order to do that. And one report even has it that Lyndon himself got blood on his own clothing as he assisted in moving the body. So I can't say the second is in fact what happened. I can report that it is what I now regard to be a possibility, whereas heretofore I presumed that the transition was made when the body was taken out of the casket. It's interesting that when Jackie was standing by Lyndon for the swearing, it's interesting that Jane Pauley says that.
Twice.
Because how could she possibly know? And in fact, it was not true.
Yeah, we have to remember she was reading the script from day one. We like to tend to think that those people have their own brain. But they read the script, and it's really who's writing the script is really the underlying thing. All right, the next clip we have is Allen Dulles being fired and Mayor Cabell being the mayor of Dallas, and we've got Jim Garrison weighing in on it too.
He fired Allen Dulles, longtime director of Central Intelligence, General Cabell as deputy, and it's interesting to recall that General Cabell was brother of the mayor of Dallas at the time President Kennedy was killed.
And John Kennedy's words when he fired him were roughly along these lines, that if this were England, I would have to go. But this is America, and you have to go. Well, General Cabell never forgave him for that, especially for causing the end of a brilliant intelligence career. And you can't help but feel that that's not totally irrelevant to the subsequent events when John Kennedy attempted to drive in an open car through the town where General Cabell's brother was mayor.
Dr. Fetzer, things are getting interesting.
Well, this is Jim Garrison talking about Jack removing Allen Dulles as director of the CIA, as well as his two deputy directors, Richard Bissell and Charles Cabell, who was a three-star Air Force general. These were all icons of the intelligence community. And, of course, as he mentions in passing, Earl Cabell, the mayor of Dallas at the time of the motorcade, was Charles Cabell's brother. I spent decades pondering the connection between the CIA and Dallas, Gary. And it was while I was teaching at New College at the University of South Florida that I realized this connection had to be between the Cabells. I don't know what led me to stumble over it. I mean, and I went to the archives in the library of New College and found a who's who for 1965, and I'll just never forget reading those passages about Charles Cabell, born in Dallas to 1903, Earl Cabell, born near Dallas in 1906. I mean, I put it in Assassination Science, the very page where I'd read those reports, and you know, very disconcerting, but there it was. Dealey Plaza, therefore, was their backyard. I mean, if you're going to set up an assassination, what better than to do it in an area where the mayor controls the police force and the sheriff and all that are tied in together. They're virulently anti-Kennedy. This was the most right-wing community in the United States. And the idea that the Secret Service should have done searches and found there was no threat to the safety of the president within 50 or 100 miles is simply absurd. One more indication of how they tidied things up. And then, of course, during the motorcade and so forth, we have more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit.
And we have, how big can the connection be to the CIA that the mayor, his brother, is, how close can you be?
Well, that's about as close as it gets. So, you know, I have no doubt. I mean, this is the tie-in. But the whole, you know, the Texas oilmen wanted him out. I mean, Hoover was a chum with the Texas oilmen, used to come to the home of Clint Murchison Sr. on his way to Del Mar Racetrack in California with his close personal friend, Ty Colson. And when Edgar put down a bet his horse invariably won. And it turns out that the Del Mar racetrack was owned by Clint Murchison. I mean, the evening before at the ratification meeting where Madeline Duncan Brown was present, she thought initially that it was in honor of J. Edgar, but in fact, as the evening wore on, she discovered it assumed a rather different aspect. Richard Nixon, of course, was there, George Brown of Root Heavy Construction, and H.L. Hunt was there, and John J. McCloy was there, and late in the evening, Lyndon shows up, and they disappear into a boardroom for a conference of 15 or 20 minutes, and when it's over, he strides toward her. She expects he's going to whisper sweet nothings in her. Instead, he tells her in a hateful tone of voice, after tomorrow, he's not going to have to put up with embarrassment from those Kennedy boys any longer. That's not a threat. That's a promise.
Yeah, but don't forget, Mayor Cabell is calling for us not to be pointing any fingers at anyone at a time like this.
Mayor, I would think that the feeling is that in the broad moral sense at least, that all of us share in what has happened here today, but this city, as you say, is not a city where things like this are done. The minority, it's a loud one, and today, this tragic thing that happens really once in a lifetime.
This is a guilt that doesn't belong. Single out for criticism any individual or any group, yet the irrational act of a single man. I can't point my finger. This is no time to point fingers. This is a time of prayer and sober reflection. We all have to search our souls with reference to what we might have said or done to have brought about a calamity of this sort.
This is not a time to point the finger at anything except just the conscience of the nation as a whole.
All right, what do you say about that one, Dr. Fetzer?
Well, obviously self-serving. He doesn't want the finger pointed because it's likely to come back toward him. He was very much involved with a citizens' council that ran Dallas, and they were extreme right-wingers, and they all despised JFK. So, in addition, of course, you got Walter Cronkite here. But there's an irony because Earl Cabell would subsequently be elected to Congress, to the House of Representatives. And when the Assassination Records Review Board panel came to Dallas to take depositions, would you believe they met in the Earl Cabell Federal Building? It was enough to make me feel nauseous, Gary.
Are you telling me that the mayor went on to be a congressman?
Yeah, he went on to be a congressman. And when the ARRB came to Dallas to take depositions about the assassination, they met in the Earl Cabell Federal Building.
Wow. And the inspector becomes a senator. It just seems to be the way to the top. My goodness. All right, here's Police Chief Curry once again. And you did say he wasn't the brightest of all. I really like the man because he seemed to have given us a lot of information because he seems to be trying to be honest. And he's really telling. So let's see about Police Chief Curry and the evidence we have.
The police chief in Dallas says that he was informed by the FBI last night that they interrogated Oswald 2 weeks ago in Dallas, but he does not know the results of that interrogation, why it was ordered, or, he says, or neither was he advised that the interrogation had taken place until last night.
Is there any indication from the investigation to date that would indicate motive on the part of Mr. Oswald?
So far as I know, there's no indication of it. Are you satisfied that you've got him traced directly from the scene of the shooting to his arrest? Yes. Well, now, wait. You mean from the scene of the presidential assassination? Yeah. To the time? No, we haven't got all of it. How much time is involved in there? How big a lot of time? Roughly 45 minutes, I believe. You still don't know. He doesn't have a car. I understand that he does not have a car.
Do you have anything other than circumstantial evidence right now?
Well, we have some physical evidence.
Can you tell us anything about that physical evidence?
No, sir, I wouldn't. I don't think I should discuss that.
Now, do you feel that this case is proceeding as efficiently as you would like it to proceed, or are some doubts beginning to grow as to whether this, in fact, is the man?
No doubts are beginning to grow, but it's a very difficult investigation.
Are the resources being applied to this investigation adequate, in your opinion?
Yes.
Would you describe them for us?
We're just using all means possible in the scientific investigations. These are interrogation and scientific, other scientific aids outside of physical evidence or any other means that we have.
All right, here's Chief Curry's.
Well, he's claiming they got physical evidence to connect Oswald to the shooting, but actually what they have is extremely flimsy. And when they conducted their own nitrate test, of course, he turned out to be positive for his hands but negative for his cheek, which indicated he hadn't fired a rifle or a carbine. And the fact that it was positive for his hands meant that he had not washed it off his cheek, because in doing so he would have washed it off his hands. And the nitrates on his hands were innocently explainable because he worked in a book depository moving boxes of books, and books are printed in ink which are loaded with nitrates. When Oswald was shown a backyard photograph, of course, he said it was his face pasted on someone else's body, and with time he'd be able to prove it. Jim Mars and I, of course, have done precisely that, and cited the additional work leading to exactly the same conclusion of Jack White, and as well Judith Very Baker, who turns out to be extremely talented, and who, may I observe in passing, has just put the final nail in cementing the case for Oswald as doorman by demonstrating that the shirt Robert Groden had photographed Billy Lovelady wearing, this is a red and black checkered shirt, not the shirt that Billy showed to the FBI, which was a short-sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt, which he was actually wearing, but the shirt that Groden and the authorities claim he was wearing is not consistent with the shirt on doorman when it's subjected to pixel degeneration. It's a completely brilliant study, and everyone needs to read it. It's entitled JFK, Judith Very Baker Cements Oswald in the Doorway, a brilliant piece of work. And I think there should be no basis whatsoever in the future for critics to complain that we haven't proven our case. It's been proven every possible way. Height, weight, build, shirt, T-shirt, so forth. Oswald, of course, told Fritz he was out with Bill Shelley in front. And we have the photographic evidence where a face was obfuscated, which turns out to have been Bill Shelley's, I think because they were worried, since Oswald had said that, if Bill Shelley were there, how could they explain away his making that remark unless he'd been there himself, where they had also shifted one of the figures behind Oswald, but done so in a way that it obliterated his left shoulder, so that unless a man can have no clavicle, it's anatomically impossible, and then the figure is both behind and in front of him at the same time. And then slightly to the left of the doorman is this figure with his upraised hand, whose face has been obscured, who appears to be wearing a short-sleeved shirt. Billy said he was 2 to 3 inches shorter and 15 to 20 pounds heavier than Oswald, and that figure appears to satisfy those constraints. And as Ralph Sinkay demonstrated in an article entitled Oswald's Arrow, a very clever move was made by Joseph Ball when questioning Billy Lovelady and asking him to mark in a black pen on a photograph where he had been standing, and he appears to have marked in a black pen where he actually was standing was upraised arms, but Joe Ball made it look as though he'd identified himself as being the doorman figure, but where Ralph detected remnants of the arrow that Billy had drawn. It's completely brilliant work, and those who are carping and complaining about this and claiming it's absurd are simply either ignoring the evidence or, unfortunately, far more plausibly, deliberately suppressing the truth. This is a major discovery. It means not only was Lee Oswald not the lone gunman, he cannot have even been one of the shooters. So all this fits together in quite a package, Gary. It's really a fascinating history.
All right, this is The Real Deal with Dr. James Fetzer. We've been going through the montage of clips from Revision of Evidence. We'll be right back. All right, back to The Real Deal. We've got Dr. James Fetzer commenting on our fantastic montage. Now, the first time we've heard it, was Oswald connected to any prominent communist organizations?
Is he a member of any communist front organization?
That I can't say at the present time.
Any organizations that he belongs to that you know of?
Well, the only one I mentioned was the Free Cuba movement, or whatever that.
Fair play.
Fair play for Cuba, I believe was that.
Why do you think he would want to kill the president?
The only thing I do is take the evidence presented to jury, and I don't pass on why he did it or anything else. We're just interested in proving that he did it, which I think we have.
The suspect will be interrogated some more. At the same time, all the loose ends will be tied together in one neat package.
All right, all the loose ends are tied in one neat package.
Well, this is Henry Wade, the district attorney for Dallas, screwing up by calling the Free Cuba, which would be an anti-Cuba organization, and I dare say this is the occasion when Jack Ruby calls out to correct him, and he changes it to Fair Play for Cuba, which committee, which of course was pro-Castro organization intended to make Oswald look like a communist sympathizer. And would you believe at the time when he was in New Orleans handing out pamphlets for the Fair Play for Cuba committee, he was the only member of the organization in New Orleans.
Right, and Henry Wade pretends that he doesn't know Jack Ruby. What do you know about that?
Well, you know, Gary, Jack was known to half of the Dallas police. He's a very well-known figure in Dallas. He ran the club, the Carousel Club, which was a very popular spot. He had, I guess, the best strippers in town. I believe he was giving the officers complimentary drinks, though I could be mistaken about that, but he was a very familiar guy. Henry Wade had to have known Jack Ruby. In fact, Richard Nixon even had employed him as an investigator when he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee early in his career in Congress.
All right, now, all of a sudden, everyone is saying that this effort is a joint investigation of many different agencies.
Adds one to the case for conspiracy then, and the Dallas police are apparently trying to add another.
No, we're still working on the evidence. This has been a joint effort by the Secret Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Dallas Police Department, the Dallas Sheriff's Office, my office, and Captain Will Fritz has been in charge of it.
We want to say this, that this investigation has been carried on jointly by the FBI, the Secret Service, the Rangers, and the Dallas Police Department. Captain Fritz has been in charge.
He's in charge of both. Will you have a further statement?
Well, it's pretty fascinating because we have a whole host of organizations that were complicit in the assassination and the cover-up. The FBI, of course, playing the prominent role in the cover-up. The Secret Service, of course, having set him up for the hit. And if I'm right in my identification, Harry Weatherford, who was a deputy sheriff, fired the first shot from the top of the county records building that hit JFK in the back. And Roscoe White was on the grassy knoll, was in his police uniform, and fired a shot where he appears, in my opinion, to have pulled it, meaning pulled himself slightly off the target, because had he followed through, he would have hit Jackie, and they were under strict instructions that that should not happen. So he's really giving a list of agencies. I mean, where would you go if you had information, you know, that could lead to apprehending one or more of the culprits, the actual shooters, for example? The Secret Service, but they set him up for the hit. The FBI, but it was covering it up. The Dallas Sheriff's Department, Bill Jacker, who ran Dallas with an iron hand, instructed that security for the presidential detail should end at Houston and Elm. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? And also that they should really not provide any security for the president, but formally, technically, it ended at that juncture. And, of course, the Dallas Police Department was very active in framing Oswald for the crime. So, you know, it was a situation of total control, which is one of the reasons why the conspirators were so confident that they could pull this off and get away with it.
Yeah, it's just one big old free-for-all over there in Dallas. All right, now, Will Fritz.
Well, not necessarily, no.
Captain Fritz, is he showing any sign at all of cracking?
No, I couldn't say about that.
Captain Will Fritz, the chief interrogator of Lee Oswald here at the Dallas County Police Station.
How far back have you been able to trace it?
I wouldn't want to
to...
Was it Ford in town, for instance?
I wouldn't want to talk about that right now. Thank you.
Did you talk to him? Do you know who the bus driver?
Yes, sir. I know the bus driver. Yes, sir.
What does he say about Russia?
This interview is being conducted with Captain Will Fritz, chief of the Dallas Homicide Squad. Mr. Fritz enjoys a reputation, one of the finest interrogators, not only in the state of Texas, but in the Southwest. He's been working constantly on Lee Oswald, but as he himself says, he feels no closer to a confession now than he did before. This, of course, is nothing detrimental to the captain. It does say something about the determination of Lee Oswald.
All right. Will Fritz didn't say a word to anybody.
Nothing has ever impressed me about Will Fritz. I mean, I was astonished when it turned out that we actually had handwritten notes from the interrogation, which I heretofore had not believed were in existence, but which included the very significant sentence, "out with Bill Shelley in front," which Oswald clearly provided in response to a question of where he was at the time of the shooting. I'll say about Chief Curry, something good he did after he retired from the Dallas Police Department and became the head of security for 7-Eleven stores, was to publish a paperback entitled Jesse Curry's JFK Assassination File, which included a lot of photographs and documents from the assassination, including one where I believe I was the first to identify the figure of George H.W. Bush standing in front of the book depository. For those who don't know about Bush's role in all of this, you want to check out the article by Richard Hook entitled, "Did George H.W. Bush Coordinate a JFK Hit Team?" To which the answer appears to be emphatically yes.
Amazing. All right, Will Fritz has got this case cinched.
Without going into the evidence, before first talking to the district attorney, I can tell you that this case is cinched. That this man killed the president. And there's no question in my mind about it.
Captain Will Fritz, the chief of detectives in Dallas, told newsmen earlier today, we have the case cinched. Captain Fritz would not go into detail on evidence which makes him come to this conclusion.
All right, without going into the evidence, it's cinched.
Well, there are at least three contraindications that reveal that Will Fritz was simply lying. One is, of course, that Oswald had made the observation that he was out with Bill Shelley in front. That obviously would require investigation, and in fact what he said to Will Fritz turns out to have been true, since he was captured in the famous photograph by James Ike Alchins. This is the issue where Judith Berry Baker has just sealed the deal, and I again reiterate, this is among the most important, possibly even the most important articles ever published in the history of assassination research, namely JFK, Judith Berry Baker cements Oswald in the doorway. So that's one piece indicating that what Fritz is saying is a lie. Another is that Oswald had told him, when shown a backyard photograph, that it was his face pasted on someone else's body. As I've explained, Jim Mars, in an article entitled Framing the Patsy, the Case of Lee Harvey Oswald, explain how we have been able to prove that what Lee said was exactly true, and where Jack White and Judith Berry Baker both have made substantiating studies of their own independently. So, I mean, there's just no doubt about the backyard photographs having been faked, no doubt at all. And number three, remember, when Roger Craig identified him as the man he saw getting into this vehicle in front of the book depository, Lee said that station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne, and there's no need to drag her into this. She had nothing to do with it. Well, the fact is that Ruth Payne appears to have been working for the CIA. I published an article about a review of the book Mrs. Payne's Garage, which is a piece of pulp where you can find it on assassinationscience.com. And she really did play a key role in setting him up and helping to get him the job in the book depository, where apparently she was aided and abetted by David Atlee Phillips in getting the Patsy into position. But the fact that you had Roger Craig seen him come down and get into a vehicle had to tell Will Fritz that there were accomplices here. So that, you know, on the face of it, he didn't have a cinch case. He had a case that was wide open for which he could hardly know which end was up.
All right, security's tight for Oswald.
Well, I am presently in the basement of the Dallas Municipal Building, and it is like an armed camp. For the past half hour, scores of police have been filing past me, carrying riot guns and rifles. Police officials are frankly worried. They don't want anything to happen to Oswald.
Thank you, Bill. We have other remote facilities at the county jail now, awaiting the arrival of Lee Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. And for the situation there now, here is ABC's Roger Sharp reporting.
At the scene of last Friday's assassination, this is a curious crowd. No obvious anger in their faces, but all possible security precautions have been taken. Policemen are stationed at every 15 feet along the entire block. From inside the courthouse compound, the motor entrance to the county sheriff's office, our cameras will show the approach of the car that will carry Lee Harvey Oswald into the courthouse building.
We're inside the county courthouse, which the presumed assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is soon to enter. He'll be taken immediately to a booking room, and a very historic booking will be made. Next, into an ID room, where he'll be photographed and fingerprinted. And then, representatives of the press will have their first opportunity for a real front-to-front confrontation. Now, our big television cameras can't fit in that room, but we'll shoot that on sound film, and just as soon as that's processed, you'll be able to see it.
All right, Doctor, we know it's about to happen. History is about to change. You want to comment before?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, number one, it wasn't necessary to transfer him. I mean, it really simply wasn't necessary. They simply had to concoct a scenario under which there would be the opportunity for someone to kill him. And, of course, the designated shooter would be Jack Ruby. They changed his clothing into a dark sweater before he came down, and I believe that was so that the blood, which would also be dark, wouldn't be photographically identifiable. In other words, you couldn't tell exactly where he'd been hit or how seriously from a video record. And number three, there are some, and I won't give you the names, but there are a couple names in my mind who will make the kind of argument that obviously it was just by chance because they delayed the transfer so that, you know, Jack Ruby couldn't have known when the transfer was going to take place in order to be there to shoot him by prearrangement, which ignores the obvious. They were waiting for Jack Ruby. They simply held up on the transfer until they knew Jack Ruby was in place, and then they brought Oswald out. So, you know, there are a lot of really trifling kinds of arguments that are made by students who haven't really given this enough thought. And there it is. I mean, he knew too much. They had to get rid of him. They did. Of course, they transported him in an ambulance, and I believe we're giving him CPR, which is the opposite of what you should do with a patient who has internal injuries because it'll accelerate the bleeding. Chuck Crenshaw, whom I knew personally, was responsible for his treatment in trauma room number 2 just 2 days after he'd been present in trauma room number 1 when they were looking after the moribund JFK, and where he was notified by the telephone operator for the hospital that he had a phone call from the president. He got on the phone, and there was this booming voice of Lyndon Johnson asking for a deathbed confession from the assassin. And Crenshaw explained to LBJ that actually he'd taken a turn for the better, and he did not think that he was going to die. And Johnson said, well, there'd be a man there to take the confession, and he wanted that confession. And when Chuck got back to the room, indeed, there was a sinister-looking guy in a trench coat whom I believe to have been David Sanchez Morales. But Oswald took a turn for the worse and died. There would be no deathbed confession.
All right, here we go. History is about to change.
That
Lee Harold Oswald has been shot. The man who saw the shot fired said it was fired by a man wearing a black hat, a brown coat, a man that everyone down here thought was a Secret Service agent.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City.
More caution and protection has been used for this man than anything had ever been seen in the city of Dallas, probably more than had been used to protect the President of the United States. In fact, Dallas City Hall is normally a public building, but today it was really under armed guard.
Jack.
An ambulance apparently had been standing by in case of emergency. It was rushed up, and Oswald put into it, taken to Parkland Hospital. Dean said, one man up there said that the suspect, Ruby, was mumbling as officers seized him.
Lee Oswald is currently undergoing surgery for a single gunshot wound that entered on his left side and did not exit. The patient is in extremely critical condition. Dr. Shires will make a personal statement when the surgery is completed.
Mr. Landrigan, you indicated that you had made some preparations for this eventuality.
As I said, our job is to be prepared. We had received word that there was quite a crowd down there, and on the possibility that there might be some type of disorder, we had alerted our emergency room to be prepared.
Some additional information we found out is that early this morning, according to a Dallas police officer, they received the following call. I quote, "I don't want any problems. I don't want any policemen to get hurt. But there's one group that's going to get, we leave a word out, that man," referring to Oswald, "when he is transferred." This call reportedly came in early this morning.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, let's close out the show with the warning to the Dallas Police Department.
Well, it's just ridiculous that they would claim he had even more security than the president. I mean, you know, he had about comparable, because in both cases, the Dallas police were setting up Oswald for the hit, just as the Secret Service was setting up JFK for the hit. Remember, 2 agents were left behind at Love Field who would have been riding on or running beside the presidential limo. The vehicles were all put in the wrong position, with the presidential limousine out front when it should have been in the middle. The motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 and instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels. The manhole covers were not welded shut. Windows were left open. The crowd was not under control. The 112th Military Intelligence Unit was ordered to stand down. The crowd was spilling out 8, 10, 12 deep. We have a photograph where the president is driving beside a bus. He's driving beside a bus while the crowd spills out into the street. It's about as outrageous a situation as it could be. They turned from Houston, you know, from Main Street onto Houston and onto Elm. That was the change that was made 4 days ahead, on the 18th, ahead of the 22nd, apparently by John Connolly feigning a phone call to Kenny O'Donnell. And then a 120-degree back turn onto Elm, slowing down the limousine dramatically, which was another violation of Secret Service procedure. And then, lo and behold, the driver, William Greer, after bullets have already begun to be fired, pulls the limousine to the left into a halt to make sure JFK would be killed. And the limousine stop endured long enough that we now know from a study by Larry Revere of the motorcycle escorts that Bobby Hargis, who was riding to the left rear, actually ran across the street in between the limousines, which would have been impossible had they been moving. In addition, of course, they took the limousine from Parkland when passengers noticed the through-and-through hole in the windshield, and one officer apparently stuck a pencil through it to make sure it wouldn't be further under observation. One of the agents got a bucket of sponge and water and began washing the brains and blood out, who may have been Sam Kenny, according to his former neighbor. Now Sam Kenny is deceased, who also told his neighbor he found the bullet and put it in the hospital on a stretcher. And this is not completely implausible, for the reason that the shot fired by Harry Weatherford from the top of the county records building was using a sabot, a plastic collar. It appears he was using a 30-06 to fire Mannlicher Carcalo bullet that only penetrated shallow, about the second knuckle in your little finger. It was 5.5 inches down to below the collar to the right of the spinal column. that could have easily worked out in the limousine. So I don't discount what Sam Kinney's neighbor reported Sam Kinney had confided in him. And of course, the autopsy x-rays and the photographs were collected by Roy Kellerman at Bethesda, where the x-rays had been exposed and developed, the photographs exposed but not developed, so they weren't even available to the physicians in composing their fabricated autopsy report. It's all grossly embarrassing. But if you say, you know, Lee Oswald got even more protection than did the President of the United States, I'd say it's a pretty close call. But in both cases, the organizations that ought to have been acting to preserve their safety were in fact setting them up for their hits.
Yeah, I've heard Jim Morris say that it was a different place in time at that time in Dallas, and my goodness, it just seemed like a circus over there. So, all right, Dr. Fetzer, it's been fun, and it's been quite a journey for the truth of the JFK assassination this week.
Stand by for Larry Rivera's discussion of the new book by Gail Nix. I think you're going to find this quite fascinating.